Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. I would invite you, Linda has a facsimile of the first folio. If you're interested in feeling what the book is like, please come down a little closer and closer in together so that we can pass it around the theater. I would also invite you to put your cell phones away for the duration of the lecture and enjoy our time together with Linda. My name is Julie Biondo Edwards. I'm an associate professor in the Mansfield Library and the project director for First Folio, the book that gave us Shakespeare. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is our first public lecture as part of the programming for the First Folio, and I am really happy that you have joined us. I invite you to continue learning with us throughout the time that the Folio is here with us. So we have student performances of Shakespeare tomorrow in the Mansfield Library. Next week in this space, same time, same place, Professor John Hunt is going to present on Shakespeare, Johnson, and literary immortality. And there is a lot of other programming that we have scheduled for the next week and few days that the Folio is here. You can also stop in to see the Folio after the lecture tonight. The museum is open until 9 o'clock this evening, and so you're welcome to stop by and see the First Folio on your way out this evening. For more information about museum hours and programming, please visit the First Folio's website. We're at www.lib.umt.edu/folio. When Barbara Kustra, the director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, and I first started collaborating on bringing the First Folio to Montana, I was talking with a friend, and he said to me, "You must get Linda Woodbridge." At the time, I didn't know Linda, but I sent her an email explaining the project, and she came on board as a speaker and as a scholar. In the 2 years since I first contacted her, I have been impressed with her great intelligence, her commitment to this project, and her warmth and generosity. Receiving her PhD from UCLA, Linda Woodbridge taught at the University of Alberta in Canada from 1970 to 1994, where she eventually chaired an English department of 71 professors and served as an elected member of the University Board of Governors. She was the first recipient of an annual award given by the Academic Women's Association at the University of Alberta for lifetime contributions to the betterment of women on campus. And she was one of 5 recipients at the University of Alberta of the Rutherford Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Moving to Pennsylvania State University in 1994, she was named Distinguished Professor in 2002 and became the Vice Chair in Humanities in 2006. She was one of 4 recipients at Penn State of the Atherton Award for Excellence in Teaching and was one of 4 recipients at Penn State of the Faculty Scholar Medal for Research. She spent a year as a long-term fellow at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., from which our First Folio comes. And in 2008-2009, she held a Guggenheim Fellowship. She has published 8 books on the English Renaissance literature and served as president of the Shakespeare Association of America. In 2011, she retired with her husband to Montana, where she grew up, and she now busies herself with her 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren, hikes daily with her dog, and teaches for the Montana Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. I am so proud and pleased to have Linda here with us today. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Julie. Can you hear me? I want to tell you that for the last 2 years, Julie Edwards has worked every day on this project. She has done a fantastic job, and I think we should all give her a hand. So, Shakespeare's First Folio. Shakespeare's First Folio is the first collected plays of Shakespeare published in 1623, 7 years after his death. He died 400 years ago last month. The plays were collected by John Hemming and Henry Condell, his fellow actors and shareholders in Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, later the King's men. The first folio contains 36 plays, 18 of which were never before printed, and therefore probably would have been lost if the first folio hadn't come out. I'm not just being a pessimist. Let me give you a few statistics. In the 2 years from 1598 to 1600, for example, it's been estimated that a total of about 50,000 copies of play texts from the public theaters in Shakespeare's England were published. The majority didn't survive, often because they were simply read to death. Most plays never made it into print in the first place. Philip Henslowe, who was a prominent theater producer in Shakespeare's day, kept a diary of all the plays that were produced in his theater. Most of them were never printed, and of 280 plays he lists, only 30 survive. Some scholars estimate that up to 90% of all plays written in Shakespeare's day have perished without trace. Certainly that would have been the fate of many of Shakespeare's plays if it hadn't been for the folio. That's the table of contents. I say there are 36 plays. You probably always learned that Shakespeare wrote 37. Indeed, for unclear reasons, Pericles was left out and didn't make it in until the third folio. So, what is a folio anyway? That is a broadsheet or a broadside. So I've cut it down a little bit from today's Missoulian. If you were to fold that once to make a book size, you would get a folio. If you folded it again, so now the page is folded in quarters, you have a quarto. If you fold it again, an octavo, and there's one smaller size, the duodecimo. So broadsheets were used for things like royal proclamations, which you see on your screen, or for ballads, sometimes called broadside ballads, because the whole ballad would fit on one side of the sheet. The folio means leaf, as in foliage, and it also means page. So we still use the expression leafing through a book. So folio books were used for serious stuff. So the Gutenberg Bible is a folio. Many serious tomes were printed in folio, and also luxury books, like our coffee table books today. The quartos were used for plays. So Shakespeare's plays, all but one, when they came out in their individual editions, not too long after they were acted, came out in quarto form. On cheap paper, they were flimsily stitched together. So the folio has one fold. It makes 4 pages. A quarto has 2 folds and turns out 8 pages. The octavo has 3 folds and makes 16 pages. And then they would take these sheets and they would eventually stitch these little groups of pages all together to make a book. I have with me here 5 quartos of Shakespeare's plays. These are facsimiles. They're kind of old and crumbly, so I'm not going to pass them around, but I'm going to put them up on the front of the stage here. So if you want to come up afterwards and look at them, they're quite interesting. They're photographic reproductions, but it gives you a sense of what they were like. They're a little smaller than the quartos would have been. They're more of an octavo size. So what did the first folio's cover look like? Anything you liked, because the groups of pages were sold unbound. And when you bought a book, it was your job to take it to a bookbinder and get it bound. So I want to talk about honoring readership. Many of us have grown up with the idea that Shakespeare was meant to be performed, that it's always better to see a performance than to read the text of a play. And it's true that performance can give us a lot of things that the play on the page just can't give us. And the first one I would say is the sheer sound of Shakespeare's poetry. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Now, when you read on the page, you can train yourself to hear the voices, to hear the poetry in your mind's ear, but that's not nearly as good as hearing it pronounced by, say, Ian McKellen or Maggie Smith. So I would concede that performance wins on that score. Then there's the sheer spectacle of seeing a play on the stage. Stunning sets, colorful costumes. The songs that you see when you read a play, they're just printed, they're just poems, but they're sung and played with accompaniment in the theater. Also, there's action. You can imagine action too, but it's not as good as seeing a rousing fight on the stage. Then there's the actors, skillful actors, facial expressions and gestures that can convey so much. However, if the plays were meant only to be performed, how do you account for the first folio? Now, I think it's time for my two assistants to come up here and give us a little demonstration. They're going to show you just how heavy this book is. This is a photographic reproduction, life-size. There's the title page. Are you tired yet, men? Okay, thank you very much. And you can take it and just pass it around, and I hope everybody will just have a good look at it. I would like to thank Nathaniel and Liam, my grandsons. So please leaf through it, have a good look, but one thing that I'd like you to sense by this that you won't be able to sense by looking at the one that's downstairs is the sheer heft of the thing. That is a big book. And if you think about it, to some degree, the greatness of an author can't totally be dissociated from the size of his works. If you wrote the two most exquisite short poems in the English language, and that's all you wrote, chances are you would not be considered a great writer, because a great writer needs a substantial body of work, and that is a substantial body of work. Now, if you were a teacher having your 11th graders, say, perform Romeo and Juliet, that is not the text that you would choose for your rehearsals. Say what you will about the first folio, it is designed for readers. Why was it published? It was a commercial venture. Hemming and Condell thought there was a market for it. They did want to honor their friend and colleague, Shakespeare. They were interested in preservation. Performance, of course, although it's great and wonderful, is evanescent. It doesn't last, but the book can carry the plays into the future. John Hunt, who is our next week's lecturer, is going to talk more about that next Thursday. Hemming and Condell wanted to bring plays to people who were unable to see them performed. Plays were performed in London and also out in the provinces, but not everybody lived near a theater. Also, if you were sick or busy and missed the performance of a play, the chance might not come again. The runs of plays were extremely short. The longest run, consecutive run of a play we know of from this period was only 9 days. So if you missed it, you missed it. But I want to ask you to think about the question, is reading a play only second best to performance? Only a pale reflection of what belongs really on a stage? Are there things that silently reading a play can give us that performance can't give us? Yes, I think there are. I would like to suggest a couple. First, notes. This is a page from a modern edition of Hamlet. Those are notes. Some of them tell you what the archaic words mean. Some of them tell you that this is actually an old proverb. There's a picture down there of a game that's mentioned in the text. I know that many of you think that you could very happily live without footnotes, that they clutter up the page. But this is, after all, a 400-year-old book. And it's quite useful for us, given how the language has changed, to have some explanations. Another thing you can do if you're silently reading, you can go at your own pace. You can think about what you've read. You can pause and reflect. Make sure you understand what's going on before you go on to the next page. If you're watching the play, you can't do that. You just get hustled right along with the plot. Conversely, you can skip over long, tedious passages of clowning and punning. Of course, I would never do that. But you could. You can make notes in the margins. Those are notes from Princess Diana. Most of all, most important, I think, is that readers have absolute freedom of interpretation. This is especially important with Shakespeare, I think, because he's a very dialectic writer. When he has a character, the characters are usually ambiguous in some way or another, and he plants little clues in them in the play that point in opposing directions for how the character ought to be interpreted. And when you're reading, you can recognize that. You can hold those different interpretations sort of in suspension in your mind, or you can choose one or the other, whichever you prefer. But when you come to a play, that choice has been made by the director. And the director has to choose where the reader doesn't have to choose. All plays that we see, all Shakespeare plays, or nearly all, are performed cut for reasons I'll go into later, mainly length, mainly also that our modern ears are not attuned to the long speeches in Shakespearean dialogue. But sometimes they're cut because certain lines don't fit the director's interpretation, right? So that they're cut in ways that slant the play one way or the other. When you're a reader, you don't have to worry about that. You've got the whole thing there. You can see exactly what was written. So, let me give you some examples of these sort of ambiguous characters that can go either way. Shylock has been sometimes interpreted as a simple, stereotyped, bloodthirsty villain, and sometimes as the wounded victim of anti-Semitism. Henry V is sometimes represented as a great national hero and charismatic leader. There he is standing in front of the white cliffs of Dover. And sometimes he's represented as a Machiavellian manipulator, using military success to distract from his shaky claim to the throne. Taming of the Shrew. One recent commentator has called them a well-matched screwball couple who respect each other's strengths. On the other hand, he's sometimes read as a sadistic misogynist bent on breaking his wife's spirit, and sometimes in very sinister ways. One thing about the folio is that it's very sparse on stage directions. It doesn't try to control our reactions by stage directions. So at the end of Taming of the Shrew, Catherine says, "I will put my hand under my husband's foot." But there's no stage direction saying that she actually does that. Petruchio at one point says, "Come, kiss me, Kate." But there's no stage direction saying he kisseth her. Just nothing. We don't know if he kisses her or not, or if he does kiss her, we don't know how she responds. If she responds as this humiliating, subjected wife or as a willing, happy partner. All this is left to the interpretation of directors and more of readers. So I would just say that reading is a different kind of experience from playgoing. It's solitary rather than communal. It's flexible in duration rather than time-bound, like performance, so you can slow down, speed up, take a bathroom break. It's silent rather than noisy. It's an exercise in personal analysis and imagination rather than a more passive reception of a director's and actor's interpretation. It is not a theatrical experience. It is a literary experience. Having said all that, does it have to be either or? Just as there are halfway states between villain and victim, between national hero and Machiavellian manipulator, are there halfway states between reading and performance, between literary and oral? Of course. Shakespeare's plays are hardly oral improvisation. They all started life as written down scripts, memorized by actors and reproduced orally. Even when we hear them orally, we're never fooled into taking them for real oral conversations. They're written in verse, for heaven's sake. Audiences of Shakespeare's day heard them, and with their highly trained memories, they later jotted down their favorite lines in books they called commonplace books. So they were turning them from oral back into written. In our own day, you can think of audiobooks, which take a novel that wasn't meant to be even a play, and they turn it into a performance by employing professional actors to read it into the audiobook state. Also, Shakespeare often represents private interior thought. Now, that's the sort of thing a novel can do really well, a lyric poem can do really well, but ordinarily you wouldn't think that it was something that a play could do well. A film can do it. Films can do a voiceover, but a play has to employ rather strained, stagey devices like the soliloquy or the aside. And these require audiences almost to think like readers, to imagine that those other characters on the stage can't hear the soliloquy that's going down here near the footlights. But a literary type reader would miss out on a lot if she forgot that these are stage plays, not novels. And there's a good book by Harry Berger called Imaginary Audition. When he talks about the way that we imagine when we read, we imagine, we create a stage play in our imaginations. And this requires, I think, several things, several skills. One is imagination. One is prior experience with live performance, and one is a good memory. So just as a bridge player needs to remember all the cards that have been played, a practitioner of imaginary audition has to remember who's on stage at all times. So if you're watching a play, you know who's on stage because you can see them and you can see their reactions to what's happening. But if you are recreating from the page a play of the mind, you have to remember who is on stage in each scene, and that's not always easy because sometimes characters enter and exit in the middle of a scene. So just to give an example, if you're watching King Lear, and Lear says of his youngest daughter, "I loved her most," it's essential that we remember that her two elder sisters are on stage when he says that, when he says, in effect, that he loves her more than he loves them. And not only if you're imagining it, you not only have to remember they're there, you have to imagine their reactions to that. And if you do, it helps you understand why they turn so nasty to their father later in the play. So, staying sort of on the question of whether Shakespeare intended his plays to be read, this brings up the interesting issue of long plays. How many of you went to see Branagh's Hamlet? Well, a few. Branagh did Hamlet on stage first, and it turned out he did it uncut. So unlike most directors, he kept every single line, and it turned out to be 4 hours and 15 minutes long. The movie version is just a little bit shorter than that. Those of you who went to see it, were you feeling that that was a little bit long? That's a long time to sit. In 1900, Frank Benson produced Hamlet, and it took 6 hours. They started at 3:30 in the afternoon, and they went till 11 o'clock at night with an hour and a half off for dinner. Now, Hamlet in the Folio is 3,600 lines long. And there's Hamlet. If you look at this chart, these are the line counts of Shakespeare's plays, and I put them from the biggest to the shortest. So the longest one is Richard III. Hamlet's really only the second longest. But you'll notice that the first 10 plays are over 3,000 lines long, and the next 2 or 3 are not very much shorter. That would translate to pretty close to 4 hours on stage. They're never performed uncut, or almost never. Now, there were only 2 dramatists of the day who wrote such whopping plays. One was Shakespeare, and the other was Ben Jonson. Jonson prided himself on being a poet and a literary artist. He aligned himself with readers. Though his plays were produced in the theater, he was always making disparaging remarks about the theater. And really, he had literary pretensions. We know that because unlike Shakespeare, Ben Jonson wrote a lot about what he thought. But it raises the question, if Shakespeare was another one who wrote these plays that were basically too long to be performed, did he, like Jonson, think of himself as writing for readers, as a literary artist, at least in his long plays? It's commonly said that he didn't think of himself that way, that he thought of himself as a commercial playwright. He wrote plays for the theater, they turned them out, he didn't really care what happened to them after that. But recently, researchers and readers and thinkers have started having second thoughts about that view of Shakespeare. There are 3 Shakespeare plays that are sort of test cases because they exist in both long and short versions: Romeo and Juliet, Henry V, and Hamlet. The long versions are reprinted in the Folio, the short versions in Quartos, in the individual play versions. And in addition to that, there is one long version that's also in a quarto, the long version of Hamlet. So the short versions of Hamlet and Henry V are almost twice as long. Sorry, the long versions are almost twice as long as the short versions. Most scholars think that the long ones came first and that the short ones were cut down versions that were meant, they often used to say, they were meant to be played out in the provinces where people's attention spans were short. But all of us out here in the provinces resent that kind of talk. And you don't hear it very much anymore. But the recent question is not why the short versions are so short, but why the long ones are so long. They were acted, after all, in the afternoon at an open-air theater to take advantage of the non-artificial lighting, the sun. So they couldn't run over too late or it would be dark. There are 12 plays written in this period, including a couple of Shakespeare's, that in their prologues or someplace else in the play make mention of the fact that the play's running time is 2 hours. And that seems to have been a common running time. And if you look at the play lengths of everybody else's plays, they're all in the 2,000 and some lines and would take about 2 hours. In 1594, the mayor of London reached an agreement with a representative of the playhouses that plays will now begin at 2 o'clock and have done between 4 and 5. So that's an average length of about 2 hours and 3 hours tops. So the latest theory about the long-short play issue is that the short versions of these plays were the acting versions, and that the long versions were special versions meant for us, for readers. They were specially to be literary rather than theatrical. Well, why does that matter? It matters because if it's true that Shakespeare created versions specifically for readers of nearly a third of his plays, it's evidence that he did care about seeing his plays in print. He did care about his legacy. He did care about posterity. So I would say that both seeing and reading plays are valuable and pleasurable, but the visit of this big book of plays to Missoula might make us think, should we insist that the plays were designed mainly to be experienced on stage? It seems to me that the very existence of the first folio honors the act of reading plays. The first words in the first folio are, "To the reader," short commendatory poem by Ben Jonson. And there is another address to the reader in a preface by Hemming and Condell, who gathered the plays together and assembled the folio. They write, "To the great variety of readers, from the most able to him that can but spell. It is not our province, who only gather the works and give them to you to praise him. It is yours that read him. We hope, to your diverse capacities, you will find enough both to draw and hold you, for his wit can no more lie hid than it could be lost. Read him, therefore, and again and again." So if the first folio honors readership, I think it also, that's the preface I just read, it also honors authorship. Often we hear that Elizabethan theater was just cheap popular entertainment, that nobody cared who wrote the plays, even a little bit like we don't care who wrote sitcoms. We don't know, we don't care. And that's what it's been very common for many years to say. That's how people felt about playwrights in Shakespeare's day. You've probably heard this too, that real libraries collected Greek and Roman classics or tomes of theology, but that play scripts were ephemeral and nobody bothered to keep them. This idea too has recently been challenged. The plays were considered literature. For example, there were several anthologies of fine poems that were put together in this period. And they were mostly excerpts from fine poems. And in these, Shakespeare and some other dramatists are quoted all the time, alongside excerpts from epics and fine lyric poems. So they are being considered in a literary frame. As for nobody bothering to keep playtext quartos, there's a good book by Lucas Erne called Shakespeare as Literary Dramatist. It has a very nice cover. That is the lyric poet Sir John Suckling holding a copy of the first folio open to Hamlet. He clearly just happened to have it in his hip pocket while strolling about his estate, and luckily came upon a cliff on which to balance it. This is by Anthony Van Dyck, by the way. So Lucas Erne in this book researched playlists and early library catalogs and showed that many people collected and preserved the quartos, these flimsy little individual playtexts, so many of which have perished because they were read to death. But people who could afford to keep them and preserve them often did so. Sir John Harrington owned 18 Shakespeare quartos. Sir Edward Deering, who was the first known purchaser of the first folio, before that he bought 225 play quartos between 1619 and 1624. Another aristocrat collected 70 play quartos from 1590 to 1616, and he bequeathed them to his son, so he mentioned them in his will. The second Viscount Conway owned 350 English play quartos, and the list goes on. So people did value plays enough to preserve them, but did they care who wrote them? And now we have to look at attitudes towards authorship in general in this period, not just playwrights. And it seems that attitudes were changing quite radically just during this period, the golden age of Renaissance drama. So if you go back into the Middle Ages, medieval literature was often anonymous. Some very great pieces of medieval literature are anonymous, partly because to take pride in being an author and want everybody to know that you had been an author was an example of the sin of pride for Christians. However, in the Renaissance, when Shakespeare wrote, humanists argued that striving for fame was quite acceptable. In fact, it was even praiseworthy. So one speaker in a dialogue by the great humanist Erasmus is openly musing on how he could get to be famous. And he's considering several methods of becoming famous. And he thinks the best method might be to write a book. But then he thinks, oh, so many people are writing books nowadays. And that was then. So if we look at title pages published during this period, it's quite interesting. Starting just about in the 1590s, you start seeing a real shift. So this is a title page of a book of poems by Samuel Daniel called Delia. So first you see the title, then a description of the contents. These are sonnets. Then you have a little Latin motto. Then you have the place of publication, London, the printer, the place where you can buy the book, and the date, 1592. What's missing, obviously, the author's name is not there. 2 years later, 1594, this is a new edition of those, whoops, what have I done? New edition of Delia, along with a couple of other poems, play, but now you see by Samuel Daniel, and then all that other information. So he's got his name onto the title page. Next, he publishes his works. The works of Samuel Daniel, newly augmented. Now this is 1601, just a few years later. And then next, we get a picture of the author looking very jaunty, very pleased with himself, 16:9. Another example, another poet, Michael Drayton. Ideas mirror, amours in quatrains. Again, the place of publication, the printer, the date, 1594, no author's name. 16:8, the same book of poems, now are poems by Michael Drayton, Esquire, in large letters, newly corrected by the author in italics. And next, he gets his picture. I think he's got the same jacket on that Samuel Daniel had in his picture. And I even think they might have remodeled it for Shakespeare. So those of you who have the first folio, you might have a look. Now, similar situation with play texts. Here is the first one on the left, 1597, The Tragedy of Richard II. So we see the title. Here we get the acting company, Shakespeare's acting company, Lord Chamberlain's Men. The place of publication, the printer, and the date, no author's name. The very next year, you have an almost identical page here, the same little illustration and everything. But now you have by William Shakespeare. You've got a written name in there. I think that's probably the person who owned the book, sneaking his name in underneath Shakespeare's. Another example, same 2 years. The first one, this is Richard III, play quarto, 1597. The first one has all the usual information, no author's name. The second one, a year later, 1598, by William Shakespeare. I've made a little chart here. So if this covers sort of the golden age of Renaissance drama in England, 1584, 1623, and I divided it into 2 phases here. So the first phase, 1584 to 1600, that includes some few plays before Shakespeare started writing. There are 60 extant quartos left now that were published during those years. Of those, 42 or 70% do not identify the playwright on the title page, even though that period includes the late 1590s when they were just starting to do that. Now if you go to the next period, 1600 to 1623, when the Folio was published, 140 quartos are now extant from that period, but only 47 fail to identify the playwright on the title page. So the percentage has doubled in that time. In 1616, Ben Jonson published his works. And he published his poems and his plays, everything up to that point, although he lived another 20 years, so it was a little bit premature. I meant to tell you this. The Shakespeare plays that show his name on the title page, because have you ever heard people say, oh, Shakespeare didn't put his name on anything in his lifetime, right? That's just not true. 27 quarto editions in Shakespeare's lifetime have his name on the title page. And during the 7 years after his death, there were 14 more. So here we are, Ben Jonson, one of the other great dramatists of the period, published the works of Benjamin Jonson in 1616. And John Hunt is going to be talking about this next week. There was one critic who made a joke about this, saying, "Pray tell me, Ben, where does the mystery lurk? What others call a play, you call a work." But most people think that the fact that Jonson published his plays along with his poems in a folio format and called it works, laying claim to literary stature, was something that paved the way for the publication of Shakespeare's Folio just 7 years later. So people did care who wrote the plays they saw and the books they bought. The author's name and portrait seem to be selling points for a book. And of course, there's Shakespeare. I mean, talk about a big author's portrait. I mean, the sheer size of his portrait on that title page seems to me a claim for star status. And those of you who've got the thing circulating, have a look at that. Shakespeare's fame was already great when the first folio was published. And of course, it blossomed and spread globally in the ensuing centuries. And I'd just like to show you quite quickly some performance photos from Shakespeare around the world. And this is the first mixed race production of Othello, or maybe of anything, in South Africa during the apartheid era. And it was produced in Soweto, in one of the townships. So it was created a sensation. So we don't have time to go into how Shakespeare got spread all around the world, though it's a fascinating story. But I want to talk a bit about how a number of first folios came to roost in America, and consider just a little bit of Shakespeare's life in our own country. Around 750 copies of the first folio were printed. Of this, 234 known copies survive today. That's a really good survival rate if you can compare it, say, to the perishing Quartos. A copy owned by Oxford University sold in 2003 for £3.5 million. Just last month, another copy of the first folio was discovered in a house on an island in Scotland. I hear you ask, why did it take them so long to notice that they had a copy of the first folio in the house? Well, it was a big house. And there were other things of interest to look at in the house. This is the library where it was eventually discovered. So where are some of the other folios in the world? There are 18 in the London area. In Tokyo, there are 13. In New York City, there are 10. In Philadelphia, 1. In Dallas, 1. In Illinois, 1. In California, 1. At the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., 82. So, considering Yankee Shakespeare, I'd like to start by asking, who was Folger, and why did he want so many first folios? Henry Clay Folger was the first cousin 4 times removed of Benjamin Franklin, and the nephew of the founder of Folger Coffee. He was well connected. At 1879, while he was a student at Amherst College, he heard a lecture on Shakespeare by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He read other writings on Shakespeare by Emerson. He fell in love with Shakespeare. He married a fellow Shakespeare enthusiast, Emily Clara Jordan. He graduated from Columbia University Law School. He eventually became president of Standard Oil, and this gave him extra change with which to collect books. He collected in his lifetime thousands of books from the 15th to the 18th century, their publication dates, but especially Shakespeare. He had a preference for imperfect copies, and he loved copies that had marginalia all over them, because of course that tells you something about the readers. He opened the Folger Shakespeare Library, or he almost opened it, as he died 2 years before. He died in 1930. The library opened in 1932. And here it is. You see these friezes along here are all scenes, famous scenes from Shakespeare plays. Here's another, that's a close-up of the friezes. What do you see there in the background? Oh, I'll come back to that. So just the famous scenes that you will recognize from the plays, all across the front of the Folger Library. There's the statue of Puck that bears the inscription, "Lord, what fools these mortals be." That's the main reading room, which is modeled on the great halls of Elizabethan manor houses. Yeah, that's the same room from the opposite direction. And you can see up here, you can see through to the next reading room with its stained glass. It's about the same size. This is the Shakespeare Theater, which is in the library. Very fine, small theater. One of 2 Shakespeare theaters in Washington, D.C. That's looking towards the stage. This is looking from the stage out at the audience. These are some productions there. They also have an education wing where they teach students about plays. They get them acting in the plays. They teach them about Shakespeare in various ways. Wonderful programs. This is the exhibition hall, where you can see all of these cases have their various rare books in them, and they have several exhibitions a year on different themes. That's the same room from the opposite direction. Down there at the end, people are grouped around a glass case with the first folio in it. Right next to that is a little alcove where there's a window into the main reading room, and there's a curtain over it. And if you come in on a tour, at some point the tour guide will pull aside the curtain so you can peek in at the scholars slaving away. So when I was I want to go back a bit. When I was a long-term fellow there, you see that sort of sinister-looking dark doorway down there? That leads to these sort of catacombs where the scholars had their offices, and my office was right behind the bust of Shakespeare. So, where do they keep all those 82 first folios? You better believe it. And when I was there, I was lucky enough to be given a tour of the vault, and I thought that behind that big door there would be this nice little room full of very valuable books. But what I learned was that there is a whole floor under the library that's the same size as the whole library that is entirely full of these rare books. And under that is a sub-basement, the same, and under that is another sub-basement. All full of some of the rarest and most valuable books in the world. So where is this amazing library? So this is a map of Washington, D.C., and on this axis, it's sort of like the plan of a medieval cathedral. So it's got the long axis and the sort of the cross shape, the short vertical axis. So the long axis starts down here at the Lincoln Memorial. There's the Washington Monument. There's the Capitol Building. The short axis goes from the White House down to the Jefferson Memorial. So up here is Capitol Hill. There's the statue of General Grant. There's the U.S. Capitol Building, the Senate Office Building, the Supreme Court, the Library of Congress, and that is the Folger Shakespeare Library. William Slade, who was the first director of the library, made a speech at Folger's funeral. And he noted that you could draw a straight line from the library, and it would pass through the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. And he quoted Ashley Thorndike, who said, "The three whom Americans universally worship are Washington, Lincoln, and Shakespeare." That always reminds me of that old Sesame Street song, "One of these things is not like the others." So much of the world had Shakespeare imposed on it, especially by the British Empire. But America parted company with the British Empire before the British Empire started requiring everybody out in the colonies to read Shakespeare. And yet we turned around and adopted him as our sort of national poet. In fact, in 1786, think of that date, 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, we find John Adams and Thomas Jefferson making a tourist trip to Stratford-upon-Avon, 10 years after the Declaration of Independence, against who? Britain. Here they are in their tourist outfits. They saw a number of tourist sites, and they saw an old chair in which Shakespeare allegedly sat. And as was the custom, they each cut a chip off of it. If they had only waited, they could have got better souvenirs. Well, Shakespeare was once universally taught in American high schools and colleges. In recent decades, he started to be displaced, along with other dead white male authors, by the writings of women and African Americans, Latino, Latinas, gays and lesbians. And there's been regularly, or at intervals, an outcry against this. And usually the outcry includes indignation that Shakespeare, of all people, would ever be supplanted and ousted from our curricula. But if you think about it, this is kind of odd. The American colonies, after all, revolted against England, and then they turn around and adopt the great culture hero of England as their own. The American Revolution was, of course, a break with tradition, a break with monarchy and aristocracy, no titles of nobility for us. And yet if you look at Shakespeare, it's all about monarchy and aristocracy. And think of this, 4 years after Shakespeare's death, emigrant Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were fleeing England partly because of what they saw as its cultural decadence. And the prime exhibit of cultural decadence was that plays were being acted upon the stages of England. So that lot all came to our country, but the Puritans who stayed there, what they did was they closed all the theaters in England for a whole generation. So the descendants of our Puritan forebears turn around and adopt as their national hero a playwright? It doesn't make any sense. So, is there anything in the American national character that explains Shakespeare's appeal to us? Emerson was one of the first people who thought about that question, and he thought that the individual characters, highly individual characters created by Shakespeare, reminded him of American rugged individualism. We don't have a lot of time to go into this, so I'm going to leave it to your own imagination. You see what you can come up with for why Americans have so taken to Shakespeare. But I do ask you not to neglect the possibility that the American character isn't quite as opposed to monarchy and aristocracy as we claim. Well, whatever the reasons, America has been hospitable to Shakespeare, and so has Montana. We offer wonderful places to see Shakespeare performed. So one thing is sure, if the Folio hadn't been published, we might very well not be able to read or see most, if not all, of the following plays, because these were the ones that weren't published before they came out in the Folio. All's Well That Ends Well, The Comedy of Errors, The Taming of the Shrew, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Antony and Cleopatra. As You Like It, Coriolanus, Cymbeline, Henry VI, Part 1, Henry VIII, Julius Caesar, the first play that was performed at the Globe Theatre when it opened in 1599, King John, Timon of Athens, Measure for Measure, Twelfth Night, Macbeth, The Winter's Tale. And that would be a particular loss because it has in it one of Shakespeare's most celebrated stage directions and one that's deeply meaningful in Montana, Exit Pursued by a Bear. And finally, The Tempest was published for the first time in the first folio, and it's the last play that we know Shakespeare wrote on his own, and they placed it very first in the first folio, and would be lost if they hadn't, very likely. So I've said that Montana offers wonderful places to see Shakespeare performed, but we also have convenient mountaintops on which to perch while reading Shakespeare. The visit of the first folio reminds us that Shakespeare isn't just for audiences. He's for readers, too. So I want to end by passing on to you Hemming and Condell's good advice. Read him, therefore, and again and again. Thanks. Thank you.
We do have some time for questions for Linda, if anyone has any. We have a microphone we can pass around.
And we have a runner to run it around to you.
So there's...
I think this woman's name is Linda, just like me.
Can you hear me, Linda?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, it's on. How many copies of the first folio were made at the same
About
time?
750 as far as we can tell.
750.
Yep.
And they went like hotcakes, or do we know that?
We don't know that because the records are patchy, but we know quite a few of the people who bought them. Right here.
So
Thank you.
you mentioned earlier how this meant that none of Shakespeare's plays were lost, but how do we know that this is all of Shakespeare's plays? Like, could there be several more plays that were never published in the Folio?
Yes, there could be. There could be some that are entirely lost, and there are some that are in dispute. There are some that never made it in that we are pretty sure now Shakespeare at least collaborated on. And one of them is called The Two Noble Kinsmen. One is called Edward III. There are a couple of others that might have been by him. We're pretty sure that he had a hand in a play called Sir Thomas More. One of the interesting things about the Folio is that it takes a lot of pains to make Shakespeare out to be a sole individual author. But actually, there was a lot of collaboration that went on. A lot of plays in this period were group efforts. And it seems to be that the Folio had something of a prejudice against plays that were collaborative. We don't know why, but they had a harder time making it into the Folio. And Pericles, the one that is always in now but didn't make it into the Folio, is probably a collaboration. So, you know, it's kind of an exciting thought. Maybe you'll be out there someday and discover a Shakespeare play that nobody knew about before. It could happen. Right here? Are you the class that came from Bozeman?
Yeah.
Welcome. And you are so beautifully dressed, all of you.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Some people have said that Shakespeare wasn't an actual, there wasn't a person. Shakespeare wasn't an actual person. It was somebody writing under a pen name, because apparently Shakespeare was a merchant that was illiterate, and some people said that it was like a lord under a pen name. What do you think about that?
That theory, some people call it anti-Stratfordianism. And it's the theory that the man from Stratford didn't really write the plays. That you can't believe how much has been written on that subject. And if you want to look into it further, I just happen to have a website that you can go to and read all the evidence that's been amassed. I will say that a lot of people who make claims like that have a huge amount of false information, like they're the ones who often say that Shakespeare never signed anything in his lifetime and so forth. So if you look at that website, I think that it'll give you arguments on both sides, although I have to say the preponderance of evidence is for Shakespeare as having written them rather than against. But thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. We'll go one up here and come back to you. All right, cool. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk tonight. My question is a personal one. Do you have a favorite play if you were ever stranded on an island? Is there some comedy that you would like to have with you, or a tragedy?
The Tempest, of course, especially if I were stranded on an island. And actually, it is one of my favorite plays. And I know it has been used nefariously all around the world in colonial situations, but it's also been a catalyst for many people who've been revolting against the British Empire and so forth, because it's a play about colonizing, about people who are washed up on a desert island and enslave the inhabitants. But it is a fascinating play. It's one of my favorites. Lo, these many years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on it, and I still love the play. But there are so many wonderful plays. It is really hard to choose. Do you have a favorite play? Macbeth, and that's one of my favorites too. And you know, those are two of the shortest. Does that say something about us?
I have a copy of the Norton facsimile of the first folio. Have you seen that?
That's what's going around.
That's what's going around.
Yeah.
Are there other facsimiles or?
That's the main one that I know about. I bought mine when it first came out in 1968 when I was a poverty-stricken graduate student, and I scraped together all my money then to buy it. So I sort of understand how Folger felt when he started collecting, except mine was just a facsimile. But I am not sure, and I asked Julie this, and she wasn't sure either if it's still in print, it's still possible to get it. It's a photographic reprint, but it has a good introduction to it, and if you come across it, I think it's worth having. It's really fun to look at.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'll come all the way down here.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, Jane.
I read in the Andrea May's book that Emily Folger, when she finished the library after he died, created a small alcove where their ashes would be in the library.
You know, I don't know where that is.
You didn't hear about that when you were a fellow?
I didn't, but the obvious place would be underneath the bust, I would think, of
Yeah, I think that's where
Folger
it
in
was.
the exhibition hall. Is that what?
I think so.
Yeah.
They mentioned a passageway, which sounded like your passageway to the catacombs, and that maybe there was
You
an
mean his
alcove there.
ashes might have been up there with me in the catacombs?
in that
That
hallway.
had not occurred to me.
In that hallway.
Perfect.
Thank you for your talk. Do you know if the various works of Shakespeare have been digitalized and compared, with the word usage and all of the grammatical stuff to authenticate the various plays and maybe to check some of the ones that are questionable?
Oh, yes, they have and they are being. There's a huge, almost an industry of people who are working digitally and every other way to compare stylistically. Also, they're online. There are wonderful resources online. For example, there's a university in Japan that owns a number of folios, and they are making one of theirs is already online that has a huge number of annotations, marginalia from a Scottish reader of the early 17th century. And that you can see online, and that's just fascinating. So, more and more stuff is getting onto the internet, and more digital resources are going into that kind of research. So yes, that's happening a lot.
Maybe we'll go like 2 more? Or, did you still have something here?
I have a question about the portrait that you have on. I'm over here.
Where are you?
Here.
Oh.
On the portrait you were showing from the
Yes.
title page, I've heard that that's called the egghead portrait. Is that right?
By some, yes.
Yes, because it looks like.
The
Is there any
yeah.
authenticity to that portrait?
The portrait. People have argued a huge amount about that. It's really an unattractive portrait. It doesn't accord with anybody's fantasy Shakespeare at all. I don't know, he looks like a shopkeeper, a sort of a stodgy, I don't know what he looks like, but he doesn't look like a brilliant writer of tragedies and comedies, and and also, doesn't he, his head, that, have we got him here? He looks like John the Baptist's head on a platter, doesn't he? How do I get that to go home? Oh. There he is. So his ruff seems, his head almost floats above it. So it's a pretty inept effort. And one interesting thing is that it exists in several versions, like it's been retouched over the first few printings, as if they started printing it and thought, oh, that's terrible, it doesn't look anything like him. And So they put a little more shading here and fixed, a few things there. So obviously they weren't very happy with it either. We don't know very much about it. What can I say?
All right, and then one more coming back to our group from both of you.
I was just curious. So once an actor or a group of actors in this time period got the script, how long would it take them to prepare for the performance?
Oh, that's such a good question. And because their practice was so interesting and almost unbelievable to us. Then you have an actor sitting right behind you and she's nodding, right? Because they had such short runs that then they didn't perform the plays back to back. They would change the play every night and they might come back to it, So the actors had to have several plays in their minds at once. They didn't have very much time at all to prepare. And also they never had the whole play in front of them because, paper was expensive, time was short. Has anybody here ever tried writing with a quill pen? It is incredibly hard. You've tried it. Isn't it hard? And you can imagine, trying to, they had scribes who worked for the theater who were copying out from the author's manuscript probably, and they gave each actor a part, so it was, it was rolled up like a scroll, and he unrolled it, and he learned his lines as fast as he could, and at the top and the bottom there were cues. So he had, the most important were the cue words for him to come in. And all he had was that. He didn't even know how his part fit into the play necessarily, unless they got together quickly and discussed it. And then he heard the cue, and on he went, and he did his part, and off he went. And then as soon as he could, he ran home and started learning the next play. It was incredibly stressful for them. We don't know how well it turned out. We just don't, we don't have any recordings, but that's a good question. And we don't totally know the answer, but it's tantalizing. Is that it? Sorry.
So thank you all for joining us tonight. Please join us next week for John Hunt's lecture. If you're interested in reading the book that Linda mentioned, The Millionaire and the Bard, the Fact and Fiction book group is reading that on May 25th. That's open to the public down at Fact and Fiction. There's a lot going on. If you learned something tonight, please take a minute to fill out a survey that the Folger Shakespeare Library sent us. We would love your feedback on this lecture. Please stop by the museum and see the Folio. Leave your comments downstairs for that as well. And please join me once more in thanking Linda. Thank you all.